Can everybody see my screen? All right, wonderful. It's good to see everyone. My name is Dwight Yoder. I'm an attorney at Gibble, Crable, and Hess. Really excited to have another session in our ongoing seminar series. It's a collaboration of Gibble, Crable, and Hess and Bethel AME Church. Just want to quick introduce Danielle Brown. Maybe wave, Danielle. She's going to be kind of facilitating tonight. I have a few opening comments here, but I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to participate, to hopefully have reviewed the materials that we sent out. We're excited to talk a little bit about the election that we just had and try and make some connections to the history of our country and the disenfranchisement of Black voters in the past, and what does that look like today. So before we get started, I want to just let everyone know that we are excited to continue this series. We're going to be closing in on our 2-year anniversary this spring, and the interest has been really overwhelming, and we just thank everybody for being interested and engaged and learning about the history of our country and what that means for us today. And as most of you know, because everybody's face looks pretty familiar, but we initially went through kind of a chronological review of the history, both from the legal standpoint and just from more of a factual standpoint of our country. And now we're switching gears to look at specific topics. And that first topic was voting, which we did back in October. And I'm pleased to announce that we're going to look at race and education either in January or February. So we'll send an email out with that date, and then we'll follow up with a small group discussion on the large group topics. So really excited about that. As you probably can appreciate, each of these areas just has so much information that it's going to be really important to start thinking about these issues in the context of a specific topic. I want to just highlight too that for those of you who want to go a little bit deeper, that there's information at our law firm's website on resources, and there's actually a page of different resources. I'm just going to quickly play this. It's like a little kind of script or preview of this Seeing White podcast, and there's also a new season that is called The Land That Never Has Been Yet, which has a lot of connections to season 2. And since many of us are stuck at home with COVID, or we don't have the same opportunities to maybe be out doing things, these podcasts would be great to listen to if you're snowed in tomorrow or looking for something to do. So I'm just going to play this, and then we'll get started on our small group session.
In the coming batch of episodes, a series we call Seeing White, turning the lens around, looking straight at white America and at the notion of whiteness itself. Where did this idea of a white race come from?
The 3 races, in the order usually presented, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, Caucasoid at the top, is not a biological fact. And
so it's fair to say literally that slave traders commissioned the invention of this sort of codified racist idea of Black people, and implicitly then, on the other hand, of white people.
Yes.
It's important that we see this creation was for the upliftment of white people, primarily the white people at the top.
if you had a long skull and you were light-skinned, that was good. And then if you had a long skull, but you were dark-skinned, that was not good.
Dina goes on this way, ticking off government benefits set aside for white people.
So was this country built on affirmative action for white people?
I don't know what that means about trying to salvage the idea of like good whiteness.
Right.
You know, when was whiteness good?
It is all about power. It is not prejudice. It is not racial prejudice. It is not bigotry. It is power.
All right, so hopefully that gets people excited about that podcast series. I know many of you have listened to it, and I can just say I have listened to that series probably 5 or 6 times. It's just, you get something new out of it. So again, for those of you who are willing and able and interested in going deeper and learning more, that podcast series is an excellent resource. Will make you think. You'll learn a lot. And also there's a resource list at our website. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to facilitate tonight's small group session.
Thank you, Dwight. Good evening, everyone. My name is Danielle Brown, as Dwight had mentioned, and I'm just going to facilitate the conversation with the hopes that the conversation is rich and includes everyone, and there's equity of voice in this space. And so just to go over the purpose of this small group session, really, we want to be able to interrogate or wrestle with the historical information in order to move forward toward healing our families, communities, and society. And the concept of Sankofa encompasses all of that, and that's why you see that on the slide. Go back and get it. 5 words, very powerful as we process the work that we're doing. So I want to go over the community agreements during the small group session. The ask is that we show up or choose to be present in this space. It's important that that we are present. I was just listening to a podcast by Brene Brown, and she had a author on there, David Eagleman, and he is a neuroscientist. And what he had said was very powerful, even though it was kind of like this common sense space, but we don't think about it. The idea that when we hold this space together and we're present, we're actually a different person by the end of this experience. And so right now at 6:10, when we're finished at 7:30, your brain should have changed and grown if we choose to show up and be present. So I just wanted to share that. It was like, yeah, that makes sense, but it makes more sense when you realize your brain is actually changing and forming in this space. And so in order to do that and actually make your brain grow, we're asking that you pay attention to the heart in the meeting, tell the truth without blame or judgment, and be open to outcomes, not attached to them. I know this is a very emotional time for all of us. And so really the key part is just to, as a community, create these outcomes collectively. So what we're going to do in a small group session is we're going to start with kind of like a mini lesson, and we're going to have Dwight and Sheila speak to some things in relation to the Electoral College, and then we're going to go into some small group conversations where we'll break up the larger group into a small group time to really unpack one of the questions, and then we'll come back together, large group, to unpack it collectively. So I'm going to begin with asking some questions to Dwight and Sheila and allow them to discuss some of the answers. So just give me a minute so I can pull my questions up. So Sheila, could you just explain to us what the Electoral College is?
Certainly. Good evening, everybody. The Electoral College is something you probably are at least familiar with, although I think many of us may not feel like we have a full grasp of it. So it's a process. It's not a place, it's a process. It was established and enshrined in our Constitution, and it's the way by which we elect our president. So what is the process? It consists of selecting the electors to the Electoral College, and each state has a different way of doing that. The electors then meet where they vote for the president and vice president, and the counting of the electoral votes occurs in Congress. So each state has a different number of electors, and that number is driven by the number of folks they have in the House of Representatives and the number of senators. We all have 2 senators, and the number of congressmen is driven by the population of each state. It's an old system. The practical effect of the system is that the person who wins the popular vote may not become the president. And this has happened 5 times in our country's history, twice in the last 20 years, the election of President Trump, the election of President Bush. And if you've been here for some of our previous seminars, you'll remember that at the end of Reconstruction, the person who won the popular vote ultimately did not become the president because of backdoor deals that were made in order to give the power back to the southern slaveholding states. And that was with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. That is my nutshell of the Electoral College.
Thank you. So Dwight, can you share with us when and why it was established?
Sure. So when this country first started, we did not have the current Constitution. We had what was called the Articles of Confederation, which was a very loosely, it was a document that loosely organized the states together, and there was not really a central government. And that caused some problems after the Revolutionary War because this new country couldn't pay its debts, it couldn't raise an army, and so there was a constitutional convention called in Philadelphia in 1787. And the reason for that was to form a new constitution that would establish a federal government and a new relationship among the states. And so our system is based on 2 sovereignties. The one is states, and states have their own system of government. And then there's the federal government that is kind of overarching all the states. And as these new states came together, in order to adopt a new constitution, there were all these compromises and interests that were at play. And a couple of just basic things to remember. The folks that were involved in making this new constitution were all white landowning men. And those were really the only folks that were recognized as citizens in 1787. And generally there were different states with different interests. There were southern slaveholding states, there were northern free states, and then there were small and large states. And sometimes the states kind of were in different categories. And the reason that's really important is because as these attendees at the Constitutional Convention, the founding fathers, so to speak, were meeting, they understood that they were ultimately going to need to get approval for any new constitution from a certain number of the states. And there were enough states, for example, in the South, that wanted to protect the institution of slavery, that they knew that they could enshrine in the Constitution certain protections. And when you look at the Electoral College, we'll talk a little bit about how it relates to the 3/5 compromise, but just understand there was this big concern with southern slaveholding states that if there was direct election by popular vote, that southern states would never have a person elected president from their state. And of course, that was of great concern because even back in 1787, there was a healthy debate about whether slavery was an institution that this country wanted to continue or should abolish. So the Electoral College, which essentially was put in place as a kind of a compromise, looked to help the southern states preserve their power in order that they could continue to be able to, or that they would be able to have more power to elect a president. And we'll explain a little bit how that occurred. But remember from what Sheila just said, the number of electors from each state is based on the number of senators and the number of House of Representatives. Each state gets 2 senators. Each state gets the number of representatives based on their population. At this time in history, the only folks that were considered citizens were white landowning men. There were many more white landowning men in the North than in the South, because the South had a very large enslaved population. The North, not so much. So when you look at who were citizens, the North had an advantage over the South, which means if the House of Representatives is based on population according to citizens at that time, the northern states are going to get a lot more representatives. So I'll stop there and we'll go to the next question.
So then, Sheila, could you unpack how this does relate to the 3/5 compromise?
Certainly. And so Dwight just teed that up well. So as the Constitution was being written, there was a real concern about preserving the power of southern states. And in Article 1 of our Constitution, the 3/5 clause, or the 3/5 compromise, was a way to ensure that southern states would have basically sort of a jacked up number of representatives in the House of Representatives based on counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person. Again, for purposes of determining the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. So although enslaved people could not vote, they were counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in Congress. This is also important for the Electoral College because, as Dwight said, the number of electors are based on the congressional delegation. So the 2 senators plus the number of congressmen. So this meant that with the 3/5 clause, southern states had more representatives in the House of Congress, thus more electors for purposes of the Electoral College, and therefore more power when it came to electing a president. And this power came to bear the first, I believe it was the first 8, or rather, of our first 9 presidents, 8 of them were from the state of Virginia, a slaveholding state with a large population of enslaved people. Back to you, Dr. Brown.
So then, what happened to the Electoral College after the adoption of the 13th Amendment?
So the 13th Amendment, if you recall, was the first Reconstruction era amendment. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, which in turn resulted in enslaved Africans who were now freed being counted as citizens. So on the surface, the 3/5 compromise went away, and now the southern states had the population based not just on white landowning men, but also on black men. However, as we know, after Reconstruction, there was a systemic effort, both through legal means and violence and propaganda, to keep Blacks from voting. So the result was the South even got more representation in terms of how many folks were elected to Congress, because now they were counting Black men as a full person. But by keeping Black men from voting, they solidified their power even more, white folks in the South. So the result after Reconstruction was worse than the 3/5 compromise, because now, even though Blacks technically were citizens, they were kept from voting. So the one thing that may give them some avenue to power was kept from them. And the South now got credit for Black men as a full person, not even 3/5. So the irony of it is, the 13th Amendment, while it ended the system of slavery from an electoral college standpoint, actually strengthened the South, because now they had greater representation, but they still kept Blacks from voting.
Wow. So just unpacking all that has me with a lot of wonderings. And so when we go into our small group discussion, which we're about to transition into in a minute, just want to remember the community agreements and just really use this time to engage. Even if you have some wonderings and you're not sure how to unpack or answer a question, it's so essential that we collectively go through this journey. There's another phrase called Ubuntu, which I was thinking about while we were talking, and it's I am because you are. In this space, it is so important that we do engage in this conversation, because the essential question that we keep on asking ourselves is, now what? And so the now what has to happen in our spaces that we hold together. So enjoy, and we'll be back in 20 minutes. Back, everyone. I think we have everyone back. I was in the middle of talking and got cut off, so I'm assuming I came back last, hopefully. And so how we're going to do our large group conversation is we're going to ask each group, whoever the recorder was, to share out just 2 minutes from their conversation, from whatever question they had. I know we were only really able to unpack question 4. So we're just asking for you to share out the question you had, and then give the opportunity for the larger group maybe just to respond and reflect on that. We'll take maybe about 5 to 6 minutes for that, so we have time for our closing piece as well. So we'll start with question 1. And I'll keep time.
All right, well, that was our group, and H.A. Penner is going to share the results from our discussion.
Wait, I thought you were 2.
Dwight, are you jumping?
I thought we were group 2, Dwight.
Oh, good.
Yeah, Dwight.
Question 1, group 2. Who's group 1?
I think I did group 1, but we'll win group 2, H.A. Question 2.
Well, that'll just make question 1 richer. That's okay.
All right, so the question that our group answered was, do you think our country's history of voter suppression continues today? If so, why is this still occurring today? In the 2020 election, can you provide examples of voter suppression that targeted Black and Brown voters or communities? And Donna is going to share our discussion.
Okay, so here is a sampling of the things that were shared. One person having read the book called Rising Out of Hatred, which was written by a white supremacist who then has changed course, apparently wrote that white people are gradually losing power as the demographics of the country change, and are afraid that people of color in public office will treat whites the way they themselves were treated. There was someone who felt that voting issues occurred during midterms in 2018 and is curious about why people in Congress are not speaking up about it. Someone spoke to the issue of power again, about how most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about power and maybe deny the power that they have and perhaps fear losing it as well. Or just hasn't been aware of possessing power in that way, was another comment. And that part of the suppression is an effort to try to get people to believe that they themselves don't matter and that their vote doesn't matter, but equally that they as persons don't matter. And one example of this 2020 election was the laws that were made to prevent the counting of early votes as an example of suppression in this voting cycle. And finally, there was a comment to the effect that on the surface of things, some of the arguments about additional requirements may seem quite logical. And the example was about photo IDs needing to be shown at the polls and why that would seem like a difficult thing to do, or why people wouldn't have IDs. So it's about some reason people in remote areas or who are working during daytime jobs and don't drive or can't afford a car might not have a driver's license. So that's the recap of our discussion.
Thank you, Donna. And so just from that sharing out, does anyone have anything they'd like to add or any wondering from Group 1's conversation and share out? I have a wondering if we don't. Oh, Mary, I see you talking. Go ahead. You're still muted, Mary.
Since we did discuss number 1, I think H.A. Penner has some things to add.
Go ahead, H.A. Penner.
I can go ahead if it's appropriate. Okay. Yeah, we addressed many of the same. Well, we addressed the same questions that Group 1 did, and decided that yes, voter suppression definitely does continue to exist, and there's still many racial stereotypes that exist as well as forms of segregation, and some of those forms of segregation include the fact that a lot of the communities between rich and poor, or white and black, brown, are separate. There was a note made that until 1968, it was legitimate or was legal to have people could live separately. It was legal for that to happen. We discussed redlining, but that apparently was a banking action that involved loans for housing, but it certainly had an effect on segregation. Then we got into the thing of parties. Why does this separation, or why does this disenfranchising or suppression of votes continue? And we felt like that was certain parties wanted to keep the power, and then we went on to talk about whether or not that fear of the loss of power was probably an even a greater driver than trying to keep the power. We asked the question: what people are wondering what will happen if we don't have power, and it's driven by this racial stereotyping. One affirmative remark was that we can do this together. You know, we don't have to have some gaining power and feeling like we don't necessarily have to lose power for others to gain power. Fear that's rooted in prejudice is very dangerous. Then we got into the part of the discussion was who votes out of fear and against their own interest, and that was revealing. And there were some instances given in terms of where that was happening, and I think a lot of us were thinking of other places where that was happening. But one was the Affordable Care Act, which has been portrayed as something to fear. You know, the Affordable Care Act, and fear that if we support that act, then the government will take over our lives. When actually it provides support for many people who need that kind of health, that kind of assistance for their health. I can go into the next point, but I'll wait with that. Okay.
That was a great compliment to the other part that was shared. Does anyone have anything they want to add or wonderings about what was shared? Tana, are you talking to us, or are you?
I was going to ask, do you think race has anything to do with the function of fear in voting?
I was going to comment that I attended a racial justice thing on Channel 27, and there were some young African-American people mostly. And somebody in our group started to bring up that many minorities are afraid of voting, going to the polling place, maybe because of presence of police or something. And one of the young gentlemen said that he thought voting by mail was wonderful, because he did say that he thought a lot of Blacks were hesitant to vote at a polling place. And he thought that mail-in ballots help more people to be able to vote. And of course, I know they've been controversial, but I thought that was interesting.
Excellent. Does that address your question, Lynn?
That's just one example. I mean, if you saw somebody showing up with open carry weapons, you know, in a political demonstration for the other side, I could understand why somebody would be afraid to go vote.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Exactly.
I think one of the things that's interesting to me is the language and words that are used on the side right now. Even just the idea that mail-in votes are very controversial. Like I have a wondering is if a large percentage of white males use that, would it still be controversial? Or is it controversial now because it was used by folks that we wanted to suppress?
Yeah, right.
Well, and Danielle, I would just add, it's more controversial when they come from Philadelphia, right? Otherwise, if they come from rural Lancaster County, they must be safe. But if they're coming from Philly,
and if they arrive the next day, okay.
How about the one that Trump sent in?
Right.
Yep.
Wow. Wow.
I'd like to ask us to think deeper about one H.A. Penner said, the concept of voting against our own interests. Can we unpack that a little bit? Because I think that is a big part of, I guess, my wondering. I had brought that up in the last small group before with Jill. I don't know if you remember, but that concept within the white community, it boggles my mind sometimes that voting against, that fear controls so much of the narrative that I'm comfortable voting against my own interests. Like, where is that playing out for us more often than not? And do we have clarity around it?
Danielle, for what it's worth, there's a historical basis for that. That goes way back to the colonies when there were indentured servants, and I forget the name of the case, but there was, 2 white and 1 African indentured servant that escaped, and they were brought back, and the judge extended the servitude for the white folks for an extra 5 years, but made the black person a permanent slave.
Yeah.
And from that point forward, there was this attempt to, even though poor whites and blacks were economically in the same boat, by distinguishing based on race, poor whites, even though their political power would have been better if they would have joined with enslaved folks, by separating people by race, poor whites ended up voting against their interests to be part of the white group, of the white race, and it was against their own interests. It made no sense. But by having laws in place that essentially gave benefits to poor whites to turn blacks in or do different things related to the race, it set up this system where we basically had folks that would go against their own interests based on their own race. And it made no sense, but it was very intentional in terms of how that was done. So I think there's some roots historically to what we see where folks vote against their own interests because of an identification with the race they're from and a fear of a different race.
One additional factor that I would raise, a lady by the name of Arlie Hochschild.
Uh-oh.
Stop.
You muted, Alan, for some reason. I don't know.
Sorry, let's keep going. Okay, let's try that. Morning in America, looking at the anger and the rage of the American right. And part of her argument is that the one thing that many of these folks have is their pride. And so when folks from the left make derogatory comments, I'll show you. I'll just go ahead and vote against my interest just to prove that I can do that. And so that, that's one additional factor to bear in mind.
While there are certainly people in power who all through our history have been invested in keeping that power, for the most part, as white people, are we just lazy, for lack of a better word? We don't examine what's happening. We don't examine even our own thoughts. And because we have privilege, we don't have to. If things are going along and they aren't impacting me, I don't have to, do some things that might be painful to me in order to, benefit my fellow citizens who are Black or brown. And so how much of it is that we just don't really want to engage? It's too much work. It hurts my heart, whatever. And so we don't take steps to, as someone in our group talked about, eliminate our blindness, begin to dispel that blindness that we have just because we are swimming in the water that is whiteness.
Wow, Bonnie, that was powerful. That was a great share, and a good transition. So I spent a little bit more time on question one, because we had two groups do question one, so we had a little bit more time to engage with that. So we're going to transition into question 3. Could that group who was asked to share out, and then we'll engage the same process a little bit shorter this time. And then
So group 3 was the group that Juji and I had, and I can share the question with everybody. So in 1787, a constitutional convention was established, creating the Electoral College, which provided advantages to slaveholding states in how a president was elected. President Trump won the election in 2016, even though he lost the popular vote. The question we had was, does our underlying system of electing a president continue to perpetuate white dominance? If so, in what ways? How can this system be changed?
I will share the comments that our group had. The Electoral College definitely fights the idea of being a truly democratic election. We need a groundswelling to change this. There was an attempt that got close, but we need to go back to that, to revisit that, to bring a change. One comment was that we have new ways of voting now with technology. It's very, very efficient. We could easily, everyone could vote very easily that way. Oh, sorry about that noise at my house. Plus, the mail-in, we really were grateful for the mail-in voting, and that, sorry, excuse me, just.
Timing is everything, right?
Yes, I'm sorry about that. So we felt really good about the mail-in vote. Then we talked a little bit about the problem that we had with that we can't count it. You know, the rule is, at least in certain states, that the count cannot happen until a particular date, and then that seemed to make everything seem it was a real, became sort of a problem. But we said, you know, that could be changed. That's easily affected, so that can be changed. We talked about the fact that there was voter suppression in different states, and that this does affect, it gives the Electoral College gives smaller states more votes and have more power than what their population would suggest if we were just counting votes. Let's see, dilutes the votes of people, winner takes all. Oh, it also, the other comment was that the Electoral College dilutes the votes of people when the winner takes all with the Electoral College, so that if you have a large city, large number of people in a state, you know, that really the vote doesn't count, because if the state went to the person you did not vote for, it feels that your vote doesn't count at all. And then we ended up with questions about the Real ID and why it was put into place, and whether it was just an act of suppression by the government. And if I haven't covered it all, please someone add to.
Well, I think you did well, Marty. Thank you.
does anyone have any questions from that or anything to add?
I'm not in that group. Can I still say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thinking in my own thoughts on that question, first of all, the question said to perpetuate white dominance, and I would say white male dominance. And can the system be changed? Well, very, very gradually it is being changed, very gradually, very gradually. But if you look at the fact that we still have two major parties, that's probably one problem. And then the fact that the two major parties have tended to come up with mostly white male candidates, that's another problem. I mean, there's still, yes, we did elect Obama, and that's an exception. And yes, we do have Harris, but she's still, in terms of history, still an exception. So I think those are two areas that need change, and probably it has to happen at the grassroots.
So for, it is, I think going back to Dwight and Sheila's conversation in the beginning, I felt like what you two basically unpacked was the idea that the system was designed to support white male dominance, bottom line, in every space. And like to Mary's point, we had Obama, now we have Kamala Harris, which is a very powerful space for me. I cried. And I know a lot of women of color who really did. I know a lot of women, who just did really, but even more so when you really look into the folks that held her up in that space, when you look into Georgia and what happened in Georgia, and the elevation of Stacey Abrams, that space was just so powerful. And everyone wasn't on the call, I think, when Bob was like, I have hope, and those are the things that kind of pushed me through this. You have this reality. Yes, every president, every vice president outside of Barack Obama and Kamala Harris were white males. But when we look at who's holding Kamala up right now, and I see female after female just standing in that gap, it is the push forward. And with a fight though, right? Because if the system is designed to not let me in, and somehow I got in that door, they're going to try to fight to get me out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a comment about the Electoral College. What I can't comprehend is why I think it's only 2 states that have proportional electors, whereas all the other states, it's winner take all. And I can't understand why they keep doing that, because with winner take all, that kind of negates, well, for instance, in this election, if you voted for Trump in Pennsylvania, your vote is completely canceled out because all the Electoral College votes went for Biden, which I didn't think was a bad thing, but I'm just pointing that out, that somehow that system doesn't seem to be fair, that all these states have the concept of winner take all in the Electoral College. And I think the Electoral College is a big problem in our elections. I don't know whether anybody has any thoughts on that.
The Constitution basically gives the states the authority to determine how they select their electors. Yes. And that's something we didn't talk about, but is still another example of that compromise that was made in 1787 to get enough Southern slaveholding states to vote to ratify the Constitution. So remember, the founders not only had to come up with what the Constitution, the structure and the writing, but then they had to go to the states and convince them to vote for it, to ratify it, or we wouldn't have a Constitution. So part of that compromise was allowing the states to determine how to select their electors, which...
Well, they determined how to select them, the people. Well, I know that is up to the state, but what I can't understand is why all the states have winner take all. because that seems unfair to me. Because if it were proportional, then the Electoral College vote would closer align with the popular vote, in my opinion.
I think it would also depend, though, on how badly gerrymandered the particular state is. Pennsylvania was very badly gerrymandered with our congressional representatives up until, what, a year or two ago. And so if the states are proportioned fairly, then that would make more sense.
I was also thinking that not every state is winner take all. Isn't it Vermont or some of those New England states that actually it's not winner take all?
Maine is one that is not winner take all.
Nebraska is the
Only two, though. All the others are winner take all.
Right. That certainly does make more sense. It would be fairer, but my understanding was that those that created the Electoral College did not trust the popular vote. They didn't think people could do it, so they wanted that control. But you're right, Tana. It doesn't always work with one party, or the other, and it's a poor system for a country that declares itself to be a democratic country.
Well, and for a country that demands that of other countries, except for us.
Right. Yeah, we're going to show them how. In fact.
We're a lot different than we were in 1787.
In something that we read, it indicated that the framers really thought that the Electoral College was going to be changed. They thought that it should sort of be fiddled with and changed as time went on. They didn't think that we'd still be using it as we are now.
I don't know, though, that it was ever intended to be fair.
Right.
It was never intended to be fair. It was intended to support systems of power and maintaining power. And so, when we're looking at these spaces, even just our interpretation of what we expect of other people, it's still within context of what we're perceiving will maintain our power. Like, I don't know that some of our foreign policy is aligned with really wanting other countries to behave in a democratic manner versus us wanting other countries to support us maintaining our power.
What stakes do we have? Yeah.
And because we, going back to Dwight's point way back with the idea of really understanding and voting against our own interests, that we haven't really unpacked some of that, we're just eating whatever's being served.
Right.
Plug for that season 4 of Seen on Radio, which is very much about how the framers, based our democracy on power. It's definitely a good series.
Which leads us to question 4.
I am the reporter of that. I'll read the question as I have it here. Whites and blacks live in different spaces and view the world differently. How does the history of our country continue to create and influence these different spaces? What are some examples of how blacks and whites view state requirements of voting, such as voter ID laws, differently? Is it possible to bridge these different spaces? We didn't really go after the last question so much, but we did try to identify different requirements for voting that different sides might have different views. So voter ID, of course, is one of those. For some of our white folks, I may say that's a way in which we maintain integrity and make sure our election is done correctly. And others will say the voter ID is a undue burden. There's folks who live in our city who live on a barter system. They don't have an ID for any other part of their life. So why do they need to have one just for voting if they can get along without that? Other issues around voter ID specifically, if you look in Lancaster, the 2 locations where you can actually go and get them are not located in the city center. One's out in East Town, over in East Hempfield, the other one's in East Town Mall area. requires some birth certificates to be able to get your voter ID. If you've been a person that's been moving around quite a bit because of your financial situations, that birth certificate may have not gone with you. Getting to and from the PennDOT. Then we talked about a number of other issues related to requirements around voting. Gerrymandering came up as a way in which we were kind of keeping all of our Black folks in one gerrymandered area. Try to keep them so their votes don't spread out to others. If we look the way that historically the way voting has been discouraged in the Black community over time, you realize that parents still come with that same fear with their children to voting now. It may not be the same fear that was in the past, but still is. You hear politicians talking about how fraudulent all these votes are, and especially looking at the cities where there's predominantly Blacks, just labeling that whole space is full of fraud, and it's very clear that it's labeling Blacks again as people that can't be trusted, a system there that can't be done. Some of the other states struggled with drop boxes, where they had drop boxes and all of a sudden they withdrew them and only allowed one per county, and so very large populations, like the center of Houston only had one drop box, but out in the rural areas, it was made it more difficult for people to get at those drop boxes. And somebody pointed out here locally, one of the regulations for using the drop boxes is that you personally had to drop your own ballot off. You couldn't drop off others from your neighborhood or whatever to this drop box. You personally had to do it yourself. So a lot of these were just different kinds of requirements or things around voting. We didn't explore a lot of the Black and white issue of them, but just naming some of the ones that would have affected folks specifically in urban centers a little bit more than they would in the urban area and rural area. So anyone else on my team can add other parts if they'd like to. I guess the other thing that I thought of too is just with the ease of mail in ballots, but yet, you heard our president and other leaders just talking about how unsafe it was to have mail-in boxes, and you had the leader of the U.S. Postal Service coming in and what appeared to be trying to slow things down, just again gave so many messages that your vote was not important and we're going to try to discourage you from voting in whatever way we can.
Thank you, Mr. Hostetter. He wants me to call Phil, but I can't. He was I was a student for him.
Yeah, but you were a co-worker with me as well.
I know. I tried, but I paused. I heard my mom say.
Not a problem, Dr. Brown.
So does anyone have anything they'd like to add to that?
I would like to add something about the current election we just had, and how the Electoral College seemed to give, particularly the president, another avenue where he could claim it was a fraudulent election. And there was the threat in Pennsylvania, I believe, that it would be thrown into the state legislature and they would select the electors. Of course, the legislature is Republican. So they would entirely disenfranchise people that voted for Biden in that case. And that's really just a threat, I guess it was, but it sounded quite real for me.
I'd like to go back to the comment I made a couple of minutes ago regarding that book. I'm sorry, but I gave the wrong title. Arlie Russell Hochschild's book, the correct title is Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right.
Alan, can you put that in the chat?
Okay, I did send it to Hannah.
Okay.
And so she's got it.
Thank you.
I'll send it to
Okay.
everybody.
Thank you.
Dr. Brown, did you make up the questions?
No.
Oh, I wondered if the person who made up number 4 would talk about that. That whites and blacks live in different spaces and view the world differently. Could they say some more about that?
Oh, I think I might have had a hand in helping that question along a little bit, because it was the questions were designed collectively, but we do, and so for me, as you know, my context speaking just from an African American woman's perspective, you know, what I do, and I'll speak, because I've been talking about this idea of intersectionality. I'll speak just very vulnerably growing up in poverty, and being Black. You know, an ID, you know, wasn't something that I didn't get my license until I think I was maybe 20, because I was at that point I was in college on a scholarship, you know, because I didn't know how I was going to get there before. And so the idea of just even needing an ID, I never needed an ID in my community. We didn't really use those for anything. My mother didn't drive. You know, she walked to work every day. We got what we needed through systems of what I had described maybe as bartering, kind of like, here, I'll take care, you know, I'll babysit for you over here, and you know, we cook over here. And that's kind of how systems work within not only just within communities of poverty, but also in the idea, you know, the collective responsibility is something held very closely in the African American community. And so the idea of needing an ID isn't something that, you know, you grow up really thinking about. When it becomes present, you know, you have to get there. But even like Mr. Hostetter said, like me going to get an ID, I had to find a ride because it was out of my community. And I remember like having to even negotiate systems to get to that space. And so, I mean, that's just one example. I think there are a lot of different examples of the two different worlds in which we live in. Like even just the idea of unpacking fair. Like I don't know that, and of course it does happen, but Black folks really don't talk about things being fair. That isn't, like, that's off the table for us early on. You know, we know what it is, you know, that, like I had said in our small group session, I went to vote with my 19-year-old son both times he voted this, because it was his first time and this time, but part of it was excited, but part of it was protection. Like, I'm going to make sure my child is safe in this space. And I have to think about that. So that's just the world I live in. That's just my beginning thought before anything else is he going to be safe in this space, or is someone going to try to come for him? I hope that answers your question.
One of the things that I experienced working at McCaskey many years is I worked a lot with kids heading off to college, and I really had to work with our kids of color who grew up with a wonderful, diverse group of kids, saying you are walking into an all-white situation. You need to find advocates in that world that's going to help you make that transition. But that is so tough. So Danielle's son going over to the driver's bureau to get it, it's going to be sitting probably an all lily white group, and he's going to feel very, very uncomfortable being there, not because he wasn't trained right or anything like that, but it's just a totally different world. Like a white person going into a totally Black environment feels uncomfortable. So these kids in an urban environment, many times when they go off to college or they go to some of these things that are required by everybody, it's a world that's really different than what they've grown up with. And unless we train them well in education or as parents, it's difficult to traverse into that cultural divide that is so large for our kids.
So the use of the word spaces refers to actual places as well as contextual, emotional, psychological, everything.
Yes, Mary, that's what I would say, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I would just add that I think the idea of us, people white that identify or are identified as white, whether we want to be or not, are very unpracticed at navigating spaces where we aren't comfortable and where we aren't dominant. And so by not having those skills, I think we internalize, whether we realize it or not, that the way we feel comfortable, it's therefore the right way. Because if we're comfortable, it's therefore right. And then when anything that's counter to whatever way we're used to, we don't have most of us, a lot of us don't have the practice of engaging something different in a way that we can really give it space and give it a chance without immediately shutting it down because our discomfort gets the best of us and we therefore say it's bad because we're uncomfortable. Where people who are used to that constant discomfort that I think Danielle has referred to, she never expects it to be fair. I think we're naive to think things are fair, and then when we see they're not fair, it's like, oh. And then when we realize they're working in our favor, it's like, oh, it's another oh. But I just think building that muscle of resilience to interact with things that are different is very valuable as far as answering the question, is it possible to bridge these different spaces? I think that's a tool that would help us.
Thank you, Jill. And so we're at our 7:30 time, and we want to honor folks' time. So we're going to close out with Lynn and Bob speaking to what gives you hope.
Hey, Danielle, before we do that, I just wanted to quickly let folks know that normally Reverend Bailey joins us for these sessions, and he's been a bit under the weather, but we anticipate he will be back for the next session. And just ask that you keep him in your thoughts and prayers, and we'll see him back shortly. Sorry.
Oh, good. I'm glad you mentioned his name. Bob and I are going to do this as quickly as we can. I'll say a word, and then Bob's going to follow. Some people have expressed hope because they see the slow ending of the political charade that's been Trumpism. Confident that people of goodwill will emerge. They look at somebody like Pence and they say, well, he's really a good guy. And when Trump is no longer got his thumb on top of him, he's going to emerge as a good person. Some other people have expressed hope that with the emergence of the vaccine, we're going to be able to come out from under this dark period. But my hope is buried a lot deeper than that. I do have hope, but it's genuine, and it's actually based on what I think is the character and the leadership of the Black church. In our study of this topic, it's been very clear to me that the major changes that have come when Black folks have rallied and sought changes in the system have affected everybody, not just Black people. The civil rights laws affected more white people than Black people. And through periods of great suffering, I think the Black church and its leaders have been able to offer forgiveness. And I think they've seen that in the cross. And that's become the key to transformation in the culture. And so I just want to toss out real quickly a couple examples. Globally, I think Nelson Mandela is a great example. He came out of 28 years in prison, forgiving his captors, and he expressed it in his autobiography. It came out of his faith, which transformed his own heart and allowed him to offer forgiveness. I've seen it nationally with Martin Luther King. I've just been reviewing his letter from a Birmingham jail, And once again, he expressed his deep, deep conviction that the change that they sought in the civil rights movement was really a spiritual one, a moral one. And he laid it at the foot of the Black church, providing leadership. I've seen it in Pennsylvania here with the Black clergy of Pennsylvania. And I've seen it locally. I want to just lift up Reverend Bailey's name again. I mean, here he is working with white lawyers and providing this opportunity for us to discuss these issues. And like a lot of Black folks in this town, he's been marginalized and hurt at various times, but he keeps on coming forward with the hope that there's a genuine reconciliation possible. So yes, it's tough. We've studied voter suppression. We've studied how racism is inherent in this culture, but I have a lot of hope, and my hope is based on the fact that the people that have suffered most are providing leadership for us going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lynn, I have hope too, and my hope rests in one place, and that's knowing that God is in control. What gives me hope is the understanding that just because a situation looks and surely at times is difficult does not mean that it is impossible to fix or change. I said this to my small group. A person who looks like me at one time could only be allowed to pick cotton. And now a person who looks like me can pick presidents, folks. What gives me hope is that there are people who care enough to stand up and are willing to do the work of accepting hard truths. That's some of you that I've been listening to over these times with the small groups, willing to learn, people open to listening with ears, heart, and minds. People willing and able to take action. And that's where it's at, folks. We can talk all day, but we got to be ready and willing to take action. I'm counting on that. To take action, even when it's inconvenient, even when your friends don't want to hear it and you're still going to speak the truth, and even when it may cost you something dear. So that is my hope. There are a lot of things wrong, but we can't rest on it. We're not going to build on what's not there. We got to build on what can be. So that's hope for me. I dropped the mic, Danielle.
Yes, that was a drop the mic. I think there were a couple here tonight. So that was good. I definitely have learned a lot just from our conversation. And so I want to thank everyone for the participation. I know my brain has grown since. So Dwight, did you want to share anything closing before we go?
No, I don't think so. It was a good evening. I appreciate everybody taking the time, and let's continue the discussion and dialogue in 2021. Be safe. Have a good new year. We'll see you in 2021. Take care, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you for providing the space.
Yes. No.
Thank you.
And Dr. Brown, thank you for leadership.
Yes, that's right.
Good job. Good job.
Thank you.
Yes.